The United States has never had a cultural policy. We've had, you might say, many cultural actions or programs or procedures or institutions that maybe add up to a cultural policy, but not because anybody sat down and planned it. In fact, what we've had in the United States is a kind of an organic development of cultural activities at the federal and state level, at the governmental level, you might say. And within that, there tend to be periods of strong activity alternating with periods of less focus. And so many of the programs of the 30s sponsored by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, had a folklore tilt to it. There was a happy conjunction of young, energetic, idea-filled people convening in Washington to in effect, to become part of the New Deal. And those people tended to connect up with the Archive of American Folk Song at the Library of Congress. It was founded in 1928, and during the 30s was being managed by John Lomax and his son Alan Lomax. And it became not only a center of activity, but a kind of a convening place too. And it not only did projects and did field projects itself, but also lent out its equipment to federal and state programs around the country and to universities. And through that, it began creating a network of, in effect, public folklore. After the war, there was a retrenchment, not just from public culture, but from government in general. But things shifted once again during the 60s, and the shift is marked by legislation that was passed in 1965 and 66 that created the National Endowments for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And also, at the same time, legislation that created the National Historic Preservation Program. And this sort of new high tide of legislation represented a new kind of governmental activism that was, I think, a hallmark of that period. And in 1967, the Smithsonian institution started the Festival of American Folklife, which really helped create a new watershed period.
With the Smithsonian, I think it was really Dillon Ripley becoming secretary of the Smithsonian in 1962. And when Ripley became secretary, he knew the Smithsonian quite well. He was a museum man, a scholar, an ornithologist, a somewhat patrician background. But when Ripley came to the Smithsonian, I think he turned the Smithsonian around in a way that hadn't been done before. And he did it literally, actually. There's a statue in front of the Smithsonian of Joseph Henry. And that statue, the first secretary of the Smithsonian, that statue had always been turned toward the castle, facing the castle. Ripley literally turned that statue around so it would face the public. And he knew exactly what he was doing. Ripley wanted to bring life to the institution. He saw the world of scholarship and pursuit of knowledge as a very lively, sometimes serendipitous, fun kind of thing to do. A little fuddy-duddy, not quite dancing in step with the 1960s, but nevertheless, I think led by Ripley, and Ripley did lead the Smithsonian in that direction, to broader public engagement. The mall at that time did not have, in the 60s, was just acquiring, as a result of the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech and the marches on Washington, just acquiring that notion of civic space. It had really not been used that much for that. There had been the Bonus Army back early in the century, and of course the Marian Anderson concert at the Lincoln Memorial, but never really had that kind of strength. So Ripley wanted to create this kind of civic town square, this wonderful village commons in the midst of the United States, and in the midst of a country that was undergoing change and conflict, basically due to the civil rights movement, and then as we got later in the 60s, the war in Vietnam. And so the idea was to do these concerts that would bring people together in some type of civic fashion. What he did is he hired a guy named James Morris. He told Morris to do this. Morris asked Lomax who he should hire for this. Lomax said, "Get Rinzler." And Ralph Rinzler was at that time the director of research for the Newport Folk Festival, identifying the more traditional performers, doing field work and documentation around the country, and bringing people like Dewey Balfa and Ashley and many others to the Freedom Singers, SNCC Freedom Singers, many others to Newport, and really a key figure in the folk revival movement of the time.
The festival began in '67. It was an instant success.
It didn't take much money, and I think he had about 80 or 90 people there, participants, and it wasn't programmatic or anything. I mean, he just invited some stellar musicians, craftspeople, singers, dancers, and others, and very broad. So he had folks from Alaska and folks from Puerto Rico and folks from New York and folks from Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi, and basically people that Ralph had worked with at Newport. Over a 4-day period, about 400,000 people showed up. So here you had this kind of what looked like the incipient countercultural activity happening in front of the Stade museums on the National Mall of the United States. Now, I think with Ralph, again, Ralph was joining not only an interest in folk culture and cultural democracy, but also a sense of cultural inclusion and broader civic democracy. And so the use of the mall after the Martin Luther King March was very important. And Ralph, from the earliest moment on, was incredibly interested in cultural diversity. I mean, it wasn't like a position. It wasn't like it had to be taken. I think for Ralph, it was almost natural. That's the way the world is. How could it be otherwise? And so people from all places around the United States, from different ethnic, racial, cultural backgrounds are involved. Ralph had been very much influenced by Highlander, the civil rights movement, and the joining together, actually, of the folk movement and the civil rights movement in the person of Bob Dylan, for example, in the person of Bernice Reagan, the SNCC Freedom Singers, and others. So Ralph was part of that kind of joining of civil rights and the folk revival movement. I think Ralph's grand strategy was use the Smithsonian as a larger way of helping traditional musicians, craftspeople, cooks, storytellers, and all sorts of other people to have their say. That is, use the Smithsonian and the National Mall as a platform for their own agenda. At the same time, I think Ralph was looking at the involvement of all those folks as a vehicle for changing the Smithsonian. And changing the national cultural agenda, and changing the way the government agencies and other people looked at their own culture. The festival right away was becoming a model. I mean, with the first year, there was a conference that was held at the same time as the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. Henry Glassy helped organize that for Ralph. Henry was young. I don't know if he may have had his PhD then or was just getting it. Was to become the state folklorist for Pennsylvania, kind of the first one before the NAA program had started. And at that meeting, Moash was at that meeting, and Conrad Ahrensberg, and Alan Lomax, and Fred Niffen, and there was a whole strategy that came out of that conference, a several-day conference, looking at kind of a national strategy for dealing with folklife. And there were several proposals that came out of that. I mean, some kind of loony and some not so loony, but, everything from research and documentation programs to the idea of a national folklife foundation that came out of that, to a national troupe, which was one of the kind of stranger ideas that came out of that. But for programs of recording, for exhibitry, for documentation around the country, for the creation of regional, that was really the attempt to create a national strategy for dealing with, what I might call, kind of grassroots expressive culture.